cabin in the woods, a night of terror. The sun had already begun to set as the group of friends set out on their hiking trip. It was supposed to be a fun weekend away from the stresses of city life, and they had rented a cozy cabin in the heart of the woods. As they hiked along the trail, the trees grew taller and the underbrush grew thicker. The trail was getting harder to see, and soon, they found themselves wandering off the path. They tried to retrace their steps, but they had gone too far. Now, they were hopelessly lost. The group of friends consisted of 5 people: Sophie, Tom, Maya, Alex, and Mike. Sophie was the group's leader, always the one to make the plans and keep everyone organized. Tom was the jokester, always trying to make the group laugh. Maya was the adventurous one, always up for trying new things. Alex was the quiet one, but always there to lend a hand. And Mike was the skeptic, always questioning everything. As the sun set, the group realized that they needed to find shelter for the night. Sophie suggested they build a makeshift shelter out of branches and leaves, but Maya was quick to point out that they didn't have enough supplies. Tom suggested they keep walking, but Mike argued that it was too dangerous to keep wandering in the dark. They eventually decided to stay put and start a fire, hoping that someone would come looking for them. They gathered whatever dry wood they could find and managed to start a small fire. As they huddled around the flames, they tried to keep their spirits up. They joked and laughed, trying to forget about their dire situation. But as the night went on, their laughter turned to fear. They heard strange noises in the distance, and the rustling of leaves nearby. Alex swore he saw something moving in the shadows, but when they shone their flashlights in that direction, they saw nothing. As the night grew colder, they huddled closer to the fire. They could hear the sound of wolves howling in the distance, and it only added to their anxiety. They tried to stay awake, taking turns keeping watch, but exhaustion eventually took over. Sophie was the last to fall asleep, and as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted. As the group slept, a dark figure watched them from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, the group of friends woke up to find that their fire had burned out, and the woods were eerily silent. They quickly realized that they were still lost, and they needed to find their way back to the trail. As they set out on their journey, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was in rough shape, with the roof caving in and the windows boarded up. But it offered shelter, and the group decided to investigate. As they entered the cabin, a musty odor filled their nostrils, and the creaking floorboards beneath their feet echoed throughout the empty space. The cabin was dark, and the only source of light came from the flashlights they carried. Sophie led the group further into the cabin, trying to find a place to rest and regroup. But as they explored, they discovered something unsettling. The cabin was filled with strange symbols and markings, etched into the walls and floorboards. It looked like some sort of ritualistic practice had taken place there. The group's nerves were already on edge, and the discovery only added to their fear. They were starting to regret ever coming to the woods, and the thought of spending another night lost and alone was too much to bear. As they turned to leave, they heard a loud thud coming from the other side of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the ground. They cautiously made their way over to investigate, and that's when they found it. In the corner of the cabin, hidden behind some old furniture, was a trap door. The group hesitated, not sure if they should open it or not. But curiosity got the better of them, and they lifted the door to reveal a dark, ominous hole in the ground. Tom was the first to climb down, and the others followed behind. They used their flashlights to navigate the narrow, winding tunnels, not knowing where they would end up. But the further they went, the more they realized they had made a grave mistake. The tunnels led them to a secret underground chamber, filled with strange artifacts and candles that cast an eerie glow on the walls. And in the center of the room was a figure, cloaked in black robes and holding a sacrificial knife. The figure turned to face them, and the group realized they were not alone in the woods. The figure in the black robes raised its knife, and the group of friends scrambled to find a way out. But the tunnels were too narrow, and the figure was blocking their only escape. As they backed away, they could see that the figure was not human. Its face was twisted and contorted, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. It let out a low, guttural growl, and the group knew they were in grave danger. They searched frantically for a way out, but the tunnels seemed to go on forever. The figure started to close in on them, its knife glinting in the candlelight. And then, just as they were about to give up hope, they found a small opening in the wall. They squeezed through the opening one by one, not knowing where it would lead. But anything was better than staying in that underground chamber with the figure. They emerged into a small room, barely large enough to hold all of them. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of old furniture and a small, dusty mirror. But as they looked into the mirror, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The figure from the underground chamber was standing behind them, its eyes still glowing with an otherworldly light. The group turned to face the figure, ready to fight for their lives. But just as they were about to make their move, the figure vanished into thin air. They were left alone in the small, dusty room, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they had to get out of the woods, and fast. They left the small room and continued down the narrow tunnel, hoping to find a way out. But as they went further, they realized that something was following them. They could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the tunnel behind them. They turned to face their pursuer, but they couldn't see anything. Whatever was following them was invisible, and it was getting closer by the second. The group ran as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the unseen threat right behind them, and they knew they couldn't outrun it for long. They had to find a way out of the woods, and fast. The group of friends continued to run, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they couldn't outrun the unseen threat forever, and they had to find a way out of the woods before it was too late. They stumbled upon an old, dilapidated shed and ran inside, hoping to find a place to hide. The shed was filled with rusted tools and old equipment, and the group barricaded the door as best they could. As they caught their breath, they realized that they were surrounded by the symbols and markings they had seen in the cabin. They knew then that they were not dealing with an ordinary threat. They were dealing with something supernatural, something beyond their understanding. They heard the sound of the unseen threat, scratching at the door and growling lowly. They knew they couldn't hold out for long, and they had to find a way to fight back. They searched the shed for anything they could use as a weapon. Tom found an old, rusty axe, and the others grabbed whatever they could find. They braced themselves for the final confrontation, knowing that they were in for the fight of their lives. The door to the shed burst open, and the unseen threat rushed in. The group attacked with all their might, swinging their weapons wildly. They could feel the force of their blows connecting with the unseen threat, but they couldn't see what they were hitting. The fight was brutal and terrifying, and it seemed like it would never end. But finally, with a final blow from Tom's axe, the unseen threat let out a deafening scream and vanished into thin air. The group of friends stood in a silent shed, their weapons still raised, unsure of what to do next. They knew they had to get out of the woods and find help, but they didn't know where to turn. As they emerged from the shed, they saw a figure in the distance. It was an old man, hunched over and hobbling towards them. They approached him cautiously, not knowing if they could trust him. The old man looked at them with kind eyes and offered to lead them back to civilization. They followed him, their nerves still on edge, but they knew they had no other choice. The old man led them to a small village, and they were finally able to get help. They told their story, but no one believed them. They were left with nothing but their memories of the night they spent in the woods, fighting for their lives against an unseen threat. And they knew they would never forget the horrors they had witnessed in the cabin in the woods. The group of friends sat in the police station, recounting the events of their night in the woods. The officers listened intently, but their expressions remained skeptical. "You're saying that you were attacked by something you couldn't see?" one officer asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The group nodded, still reeling from the terror they had experienced. They had all sustained injuries during the fight with the unseen threat, and they were still coming to terms with the fact that they had narrowly escaped with their lives. Despite the officers' skepticism, they took the group's statement and promised to investigate the cabin in the woods. The group left the police station, grateful for the opportunity to tell their story, but still shaken by the horrors they had witnessed. Over the next few days, the group tried to return to their normal lives, but they found it difficult to shake the memories of the cabin in the woods. They had nightmares of the unseen threat, and they couldn't help but wonder what other supernatural beings lurked in the shadows. But then, one day, they received a phone call. It was from the police, informing them that they had investigated the cabin and found evidence of a cult that had been using the cabin for their rituals. The group was horrified, realizing that the markings and symbols they had seen in the cabin were not just decorations, but part of a dark and twisted ritual. They knew then that they had not been dealing with something ordinary, but with a force beyond their understanding. As the weeks went by, the group tried to come to terms with what had happened to them. They sought therapy, talked to each other, and tried to move on with their lives. But they could never forget the horrors they had witnessed, the fight for their lives against an unseen threat. In the end, they realized that they had come out of the experience stronger and more resilient. They had faced their fears and survived, and they knew that they could overcome anything. They never returned to the woods, but the memory of the cabin and the unseen threat stayed with them, a reminder of the dark forces that lurked in the shadows. And they knew that they would always be vigilant, always